But I was thinking about, when I was a kid, I think I probably, if I could have picked a career, I probably would have wanted to be like an archaeologist or an explorer of some kind, right? Because I love the idea of finding treasure of some sort. Here's some archival footage from when I was around 8. We went up to Glacier Basin and went to, there's an old mine shaft up there, and that was like the best, to be able to try to find, and I came home with a little rock that had some streaks. It looked like gold. It was probably iron pyrite or something, fool's gold, but I thought the possibility was there, and it was awesome. My parents got me a Radio Shack metal detector, but in true Peabody fashion, it didn't have the wand or the disc, like this thing that actually makes a metal detector usable. And so you really had to be down on all fours, holding this thing on the ground. But I didn't really care. I thought it was pretty awesome to just, again, the possibility of discovering something. And I actually, digging around in our backyard, not with the metal detector, but I did actually find something one time. I found a 1929 Australian penny, which is only worth about a penny, but they're like the size of like a $50 or something. And so that made it seem a little exotic, and it gave me, just that added thought that there must be more out there to find somewhere in the dirt. So anyway, the idea of a shipwreck, that would be like the epitome of a treasure trove, right? I mean, just discovering something like that would have been the best. And I never really thought of it from the perspective of the people who were on the ship, and what that must have been like, that there was actually a tragedy there. It was always kind of the aftermath that I was interested in. But we are looking at an actual shipwreck today that Paul experienced, and going to look at it sort of through the perspective of the people who went through it. And I think actually that's where the treasure is for us, because, we can all relate to this metaphor of a shipwreck, right? I mean, things happen in life. Tom asked me this morning if the sermon was going to be a shipwreck. And, there are lots of things that we know, that sense of something being just a disaster, or something being, our world falling apart, or everything we thought we knew not being true. There are all kinds of ways that we experience shipwreck through life. So I think there's a lot of value in looking at Paul's experience, because even though his was an actual physical, real one, it really speaks to our own experience as well. So you may recall last time we left Paul in Jerusalem, and it had not gone well. And God had told Paul, though, that he was going to testify for him in Rome. And Paul was actually taken in or arrested by the Roman soldiers there in Jerusalem. But he didn't go straight to Rome. They took him to Caesarea, and he was there for a couple of years in prison. He was waiting for his time to be sent on to Rome. And so after 2 years, they finally get ready to put him on a ship to Rome. And just by way of perspective, any idea what that would be equivalent to distance-wise? Well, I'll tell you. So if you're talking just in terms of crossing land, it would be like from here going to Niagara Falls. If you wanted to be a little more true to what Paul's doing and you were going by boat, it would take you out to the Aleutian Islands somewhere. Imagine going across the open seas in just a sailboat and getting there that way. And that's what Paul was doing. So over a couple thousand miles. I don't really usually think of Alaska as being that as far away as it is, but it's quite a ways. So anyway, so they first put him on a boat that takes him up to Sidon, and then they kind of weave around from there up to Myra, and that's where we pick up the story. Luke is telling the story because he's traveling with Paul at this point, and they switch ships. And here's what he said. And I'd like you to, as you're listening to the account of this story, because Luke gives us a pretty detailed itinerary as they're going along, I'd just be listening for it to how you would characterize this trip, because we'll ask that question in a little bit. So just kind of tuck that away. So here's what he says. He says, "We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea." Okay, that was a lot of place names there. Here's, again, back to the map. So they struggled up their way to Cnidus, and then the plan was really to cut across straight here and then go up around the boot of Italy up to Rome. But this wind came along and pushed them off course. So they couldn't do that. They had to go around this other way around Crete and worked their way to Fair Havens there. So it says much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. And the fast that he's talking about was Yom Kippur. Anybody know what time of year Yom Kippur is? October. So it's the fall, right? And sailors pretty much said that after that point, it was really dicey, and you got to November, and it was just a suicide mission if you were going to try to venture it. So they didn't have much of a window. So Paul warned the men, "I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our lives also." You have to remember, at this time, Paul is a pretty seasoned seafarer because he's been on a lot of these journeys. He's seen a lot. And the Lord may have spoken this to him directly as well, but he can just tell this is not going to be a good idea. But the centurion, the soldier who was in charge of him, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. And that makes sense for the centurion because, Paul's a prisoner, right? He's not the supposed expert here. But since the harbor there at Fair Havens was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. So again, to show you where they were trying to get to, this was the plan, to just kind of head a little ways further up to Phoenix. And when a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Okay, I want to pause right there for a second and say, what's your sense of how you would characterize how this trip is going? Like, slow. Mm-hmm. Difficult. It's arduous, right? They're fighting for every little inch of water that they get through. Say that again? Not expected. Yeah, they had a plan, and it's not going according to plan at all. They're having to improvise as they're going, right? So they're contending with time constraints and weather and all these pressures, and it's not going well, and it doesn't look like it's going to go well ahead of them. And that's what Paul speaks up. He's like, this isn't going to be good. But they don't listen to Paul, and Paul is stuck, right? Like, Paul's powerless to get them to change it. So he's sailing into this shipwreck whether he wants to or not. And it just reminds me that we're not always the captain, right? Sometimes we're along for the ride. Paul couldn't just hop off. He was a prisoner. And sometimes we're not fully in charge of the journey that we find ourselves on. Somebody else is making decisions, and we can go, this isn't headed in a good way, but we're we're attached, whether we want it or not. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's, culturally. You can see things going on and you go, I don't like this, but I can't get out of it. Or whatever. I think especially now with the internet and so many things that we know about and we feel responsible for, but we're helpless to actually make something change in the world sometimes. And we can feel, though, like we ought to have done something different. And it's so encouraging and comforting that even though Paul was in that place, God didn't leave him or blame him or anything. God stayed right with him through this, even though this shipwreck seems avoidable. God doesn't leave just because it was avoidable. And I love that about him. So we're not always the captain. But this little gentle south wind, before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. So, it's the opposite direction of the wind from the south. It's pushing them away from the island. And the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and we were driven along. And so at this point, they are carried out to the open sea there. And it's fierce. It's a fierce storm. And it says they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. That's not a good sign. I don't know a lot about ships, but I know that if you're holding it together with rope, it's probably not a good place. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day, this is day 2, they began throwing the cargo overboard. Okay. When it gets to a point where you're throwing over cargo and the owner is there with you, who's like, this is his livelihood, this is the whole reason he's taking this trip, is to sell these goods and deliver them, that's not good, because now it's just about, we're just doing what we have to do to survive. And so they're trying these things. They try dropping the anchor. They try throwing the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. That's the rigging. That's the stuff to hoist the sails and to load and unload cargo, like it's essential equipment for their journey, and they aren't keeping it. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. This is Luke that's talking here about giving up hope. It's very candid, I think, of him. And I love it that he includes that line here, because to me that says that honesty is allowed. When we're in the middle of our storms and shipwrecks, I think especially for Christians, the pressure can feel like, man, you have got to keep hope. You've got to hold on to really strong belief through whatever you're going through. And I think our feelings are allowed. And if it feels as bad as it is, to be able to say that and articulate that, I think if Luke can say that, certainly we can say that as well. And sometimes some storms are that bad, where we feel like we don't have hope. I was reading an article this week by a man named Randall Gauger, and he and his wife lost a 22-year-old son. I think the worst kind of grief is his parents losing a child. And he was talking about how he just had shut down and was really trying, in his mind, for his wife's sake, really to push down everything he was feeling about it, and finally just broke down and couldn't do that anymore. And he said this, and I thought this was such a good line. He said, "It was a tremendous relief to realize that we are not strong people. We are plain, ordinary people. And if we need to cry, then cry. If we need to grieve, then grieve. Do it hard and deeply, and then move on." I love that, lifting the pressure, though, that we need to somehow be strong through whatever we're going through. We get to just be plain, ordinary people, because honesty is allowed. But one thing that I think is good to hold on to is to recognize that God's silence is not absence. Doesn't mean he's not there just because he's not saying something. And it's really easy because they feel the same to think that they're the same. I've had some things in my life that I feel like God has been silent for a really long time, but he hasn't abandoned me. And there's a verse in Psalm 69 that I think we can hang on to. It says, the Lord hears those in need, and he isn't careless with his bound up people, his people who are captured, his people who are imprisoned and trapped. He hears, he does hear when we're crying, and he's not giving us a direct response. He is still hearing, and we can cling to that. So his silence is not absence. And the passage goes on here, and I think it's sometimes when we've done everything we can, we've reached our uttermost end, that's when Christ steps in, and that's what he does in this situation. It says, after the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. I wonder how that went over for Paul in the moment, that I told you so. But he has some good news there. He says, but now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. That's your hope. You get to go to court. But it means it's not over. This is still out there. This has to happen. And God has graciously given you all the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. I love this. Here Paul and Luke, and they had a friend named Aristarchus who was on the boat with them. They're the only three Christians in this crowded boat. All the other people had their idols that they were worshiping. They were no doubt crying out whatever prayers they wanted to pray. Sailors can have a tendency sometimes to be superstitious in the midst of storms. And so they're all attempting things and not having anything. And Paul can stand up and declare, my God is the God whose I am, who I belong to, the God who knows me and sees me, and he knows me by name, and he tells me not to be afraid in the middle of this. He's got a plan, and he's going to get us through this, and I trust him, and he just declares his faith and his confidence in God in a way that would have felt so strange and foreign to these sailors. And he just speaks right up front before anything else happens. Now they know if they get out of this where the credit goes, because it's God has said this is going to happen. And on the 14th night, so even after Paul declares this, there's still more time going by. We were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight, the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They couldn't see it yet, but you spend enough time out on the sea and you can recognize when the sound of the waves changes, and they could identify that they were approaching land. And they took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. So they're moving in quickly. Fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. Then, in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let down the lifeboat into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. So even after Paul has said, hey, we're going to make it, they're not trusting that, and they're going to find their own way. And then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it fall away. which no doubt didn't help Paul's popularity here. But here's the thing, the lifeboat has to go. Sometimes we're still hanging on to our little escape route, our way that we're gonna figure this out so that we don't have to trust God and actually go through the difficulty that we can see still lies ahead and find another option. We like to hang on to our own way of doing things. Kendra Fletcher is a homeschool mom blogger who realized at one point that her faith had become very rigid. It was very much about performance and rules and how to do, and it was all tied around, doing the best for her kids, and so it all had become very much what she could control. And she had this encounter with Christ that really freed her up and brought grace into her life. But she said this, she said, somewhere along the path out of a legalistic environment, we have to encounter Christ all over again, or it just becomes too easy to grab a pen and paper and write a fresh to-do list. We want to hang on to that lifeboat. We want to keep our own options open for how we're going to solve our problem instead of God. So I'm curious, what are some lifeboats that you can think of that maybe you've hung on to, or you've heard tell that people hang on to? Maybe.
The lottery.
The lottery. Sure. Yeah. The ship that's going to sail in someday. Yeah. I know for me, one thing is figuring it out, like trying to really get understanding. Understanding is going to be my way through things. If I can just really make it work in my mind. Family. Say more about that.
Oh, I mean, it can just be like a tight fist of, it'll look like I want it to look like.
Yes.
And, we'll keep it together how I want it. And
Yep. Us four no more. Yep.
Right, put a lot of
Yes. You can just focus internally on. Yeah, were you going to say something, Nancy?
Well, I
I
did have something in mind, though, just kind of like what Claire said, talking to friends.
Mm-hmm.
Just trying to figure it out with friends that you trust and that have good advice.
Yeah. Figuring out there's got to be some other way than trusting the Lord sometimes. I think sometimes just working harder on it, going, I can do this, I can make it happen. I can get there. Or just avoiding the reality of it, just don't talk about it. And if you don't talk about it, then it's not real, right? Or being tough, just not letting yourself feel it. Isolating, pulling back, I don't know. Anything else come to mind? I think those are, yeah, Sandy?
Holding on to something that you need to let go of.
Yeah.
That you think is going to bring you security.
Right. Really, anything that we hang on to for security can become a lifeboat, and they've got to go. And so they let it fall away. And just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now, I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And after he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food for themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. What does this scene remind you of? It's the Last Supper, right? Or the feeding of the 5,000. Here, all 276 had plenty, and they ate their fill till they were done. And I love it that that Paul takes this moment, whether he was consciously turning this into a communion moment or not, the truth is that the table is everywhere. And he, in his trust and confidence that God is going to do this thing, he is recalling what Christ has already done for him on the cross. And he's sharing in this meal, and he is receiving again from Christ and saying, this is where I place my trust, in the Lord who has provided this. And he's going to provide for all of you as well. And I think there are so many opportunities for us to acknowledge in front of everybody where our hope is. Everywhere can become a table where we once again reconnect with Christ's goodness to us. It said, when daylight came, then they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to try and run the ship aground if they could. So just to close our map off here, it's Malta that they're talking about. They finally reached Malta. It says, cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail in the wind and made for the beach. But here's the shipwreck. The ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers at this point, still on duty, planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. So they make it out of this. But in order to do this, they got to get in the water, right? And there's something about this here that is a reminder of like baptism, It's leaving the old life behind, plunging in and starting something new with Christ. An abandoning ship goes with the territory, right? You can't somehow hold on to this thing that has carried you through this whole way and take part of the rescue that he has for you. There is this sense of committing and trusting. That's that step of faith to say, yes, I'm gonna leave what I know behind. They didn't know what was on shore ahead for them. The ship represented so much identity for all these people. The owner of the ship, doesn't have anything that he owns anymore. The captain, the pilot who's been steering it, nothing there to steer. The crew, all of that sense of their role and their place in the world is now gone, and they got to just leave it there in the water and embark on this new thing. They're all on this equal footing of being in need of rescue. I like what Karl Barth said. He said, we must read the Bible through the eyes of shipwrecked people for whom everything has gone overboard. Christ needs to become our all, and to say, we are now people who recognize that we need rescue, and he's everything to us. So we come out of this with one broken ship, but now 276 God stories. 276 people who weren't sure what was going to carry them through, and now each one of them has to wrestle with the truth that Paul has made it very clear to them how they made it through, and they have to decide for themselves what they're going to do with it. But God in his graciousness spared them all, and it was regardless of how much any of them deserved to be rescued, right? I mean, you think about that. You've got the people who made the bad decision to have the boat keep going in the first place. You've got the people who were lying and trying jump in the lifeboat and leave everybody behind. You've got the soldiers who had just at the end, even after Paul is telling them all this, they want to kill him. All these people that you would go, I don't know if they really should be rescued. And God's rescue is big enough for all of them. And I think that's the great thing about salvation, right? It's not dependent on us and how much we clean up, how much we deserve it. It's God's for all of us. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to prevent us from going through the shipwreck in the first place, right? The ship still gets lost, but he preserves us through it. Sometimes we still go through the shipwrecks. The hymn writer from the 1700s, William Cowper, he had a pretty rough life, rough childhood. He had a lot of mental illness that he dealt with. He had at least 4 major bouts of depression where he tried to take his own life a couple of times, ended up in an institution for a time period. And it was while he was there that he found a Bible and began to read it and encountered Christ. He was released from that institution and became friends with John Newton, who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace, among others. And John Newton could see the sort of the fragility of his mind and his need for a project. And so he invited him to collaborate with him on a hymnal. And William Cowper continued to have struggles with mental illness. God didn't just take that away from him, from his life, but he wrote one hymn that had these words in it that I thought were so good. It said, "The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy." The clouds you so much dread are big with mercy. And that would be my hope for you as whatever, I know some of you are in the midst of a shipwreck right now, and you've dreaded it. Or maybe you can see that it's you're about to go into one, and to go, even in the midst of the dread, the clouds are big with God's mercy, because if he had 276 stories out of that one broken ship, he can do the same in our lives as well. Let's pray. God, we're so grateful that you don't abandon us. I don't know how we would get through life without you. God, I thank you that you have the capacity to take all our bad decisions, to take our selfishness, to take our misguidedness, to take our fear, and still come out the other end with a story of rescue and hope. And God, I pray that you would remind us of your closeness, even in your silence, that we would take comfort in the fact that you haven't left us. Pray for each person who is feeling alone in their shipwreck right now. God, that as they reach the end of themselves, that you would make your presence felt in close and tangible ways, and that you would guide them to the shore. Thank you that we can once again this morning remember the source of our rescue in Christ and the cross. It's in his name we pray. Amen.